In December of 1142, a woman wrapped herself in a white cloak, was lowered from the walls of Oxford Castle under cover of darkness, crossed a frozen river on foot, and walked 6 miles through enemy territory in the snow. She had previously escaped a different castle disguised as a corpse, carried out on a bier through enemy lines while soldiers searched for her everywhere. Her name was Empress Matilda, and she spent 19 years fighting a civil war for the English throne. Every English monarch since has descended from her line, and almost nobody remembers her name. This is what life as a medieval princess actually looked like, and it looked nothing like you think. We all carry the same image around in our heads, a beautiful woman in a tower, brushing her hair, waiting for a prince, maybe with a dragon or a fairy godmother involved. And the dress is always incredible, and the hair is always clean. Here's what holds up against the historical record. The towers were real, because princesses were genuinely locked inside them for years, sometimes decades. Eleanor of Aquitaine spent 16 years imprisoned by her own husband. Joanna of Castile spent 46 years confined by her father and then her son, who told the world she'd lost her mind. Ingeborg of Denmark spent 20 years locked away by a king who decided he couldn't stand her one morning after the wedding. The waiting was real, but nobody was coming to rescue any of them. Everything else about that image is a fabrication. What it actually meant to be born a princess in medieval Europe, and what your life would have looked like if you'd been one, is something you should probably be glad you never experienced. Your morning starts at 5:30, not because you want it to, but because God demands it. And your day opens with Mass in the castle chapel before moving on to lessons. You're learning Latin, French, music, dancing, deportment, and the one that actually matters, household management. The real job you're being trained for from birth is running an estate of 100 to 150 people, which makes you less of a princess in any way you'd recognize and more of a CEO, except you don't get to choose the company. You can't quit. And the board of directors is your future husband, who you haven't met yet and who might be 40 years old. That education turns out to be more rigorous than most people assume. Catherine of Aragon, before she ever set foot in England, could speak fluent Latin and had studied the Bible, St. Augustine, St. Jerome, Seneca, civil law, and canon law. When she arrived as a teenager, she communicated entirely in Latin because nobody had bothered to teach her English, the language of the country she'd been sent to rule. That tells you everything about what mattered in this arrangement and what didn't. Your brother's education and yours diverge in one critical area, which is military training. He learns to fight while you learn to embroider and manage servants, and both of you study Latin and court politics. But only one of you receives a sword, while the other receives a loom. And that's where it gets absurd, because when your husband rides off to war, which he will do frequently, you're the one left running the entire castle. Its defenses, its finances, its staff, and its food supply. You're expected to manage a military installation without ever having been taught how to defend one. And several princesses did exactly that, and did it well, which makes the absence of military training feel less like an oversight and more like a deliberate hobbling. The Church's attitude toward educating women sat in a confused middle ground. Nunneries functioned as centers of female learning where women read, wrote, and studied theology. But some clergy openly opposed women's literacy on the grounds that a woman who could read was a woman who could think, and a woman who could think presented a problem. Between the years 1000 and 1800, roughly 59,000 male scholars passed through European universities compared to approximately 108 women, which comes out to less than 0.2%. Those gates weren't just closed, they were bricked shut. None of that mattered in the calculations being made about your future, because what mattered was the alliance your marriage could secure. You existed as a diplomatic asset with a pulse. Canon law fixed the minimum marriage age at 12 for girls, but royal families routinely ignored even that limit. Empress Matilda was married off at 8, and Isabella of Hainault at 10. Isabella of Valois married Richard II of England at the age of 6, with her dolls packed into the trousseau beside her. Common women in northwestern Europe typically married in their early to mid-20s, but a princess followed different math entirely. The younger you were, the more malleable you were, and the sooner you could start producing heirs, and that calculation was all it ever came down to. Whilst many marriage contracts did include clauses delaying consummation, and records show that the first surviving child typically didn't arrive until the wife reached her late teens or 20s, because some awareness existed that these early marriages carried real physical danger. Lady Margaret Beaufort's story makes that danger impossible to ignore. Married at 12 and widowed by plague before giving birth at 13, her delivery at Pembroke Castle in January of 1457 left her so physically damaged that she never conceived again. Bishop John Fisher, her confessor, later wrote that it seemed a miracle the child had been born at all. That child became Henry VII, and Margaret went on to become the most powerful woman in England, founding 2 Cambridge colleges and engineering the entire Tudor dynasty. Decades later, she personally objected to her granddaughter's early marriage, warning that if the husband would not wait, it could injure her and endanger her health. Those words came from a woman who knew exactly what early marriage cost. Now, about where you're living while all this unfolds. Your beautiful fairy tale castle is, in practice, a military fortress that happens to contain bedrooms. Stone walls absorb cold and never release it. Before the invention of the fireplace, all fires burned in open hearths, which meant your great hall sat perpetually full of smoke. Windows were narrow defensive slits built to stop arrows, which also happened to stop light. Dried reeds called rushes covered the stone floors, and those rushes bred fleas, rats, and anything else that thrived in warm, dark spaces. The historian Francis Guise described castle life in terms that would flatten a health inspector, with the smell of unwashed bodies mixing with kitchen and stable odors, the stench drifting from the toilets, and acrid smoke rolling off torches and candles, all of it hanging in the air at all times. Those toilets, called garderobes, were small stone chambers built into the castle walls with chutes that emptied into the moat or a cesspit below. And Bodiam Castle alone had 28 of them, all draining into the same water. The word garderobe translates to wardrobe because people hung their clothing inside the toilet shafts, where ammonia from urine killed fleas and moths. Your best dress lived in what amounted to a medieval urinal, and that counted as clever. Professional cesspit cleaners, called gong farmers, handled the mess. They worked exclusively at night, earned their pay by the ton, and lived in isolated housing far from everyone else, which seems like the bare minimum society could offer. Here's the thing that genuinely surprises most people, and it surprised me. Medieval people were not nearly as filthy as the stereotype suggests, because that image comes largely from Victorian-era mythology. Nobles bathed regularly in wooden tubs with heated water, scented oils, and Castile soap. Edward III had hot and cold running water installed at Westminster Palace. King John travelled with his own personal bathtub, and Charlemagne built pool-sized baths at Aachen, where he bathed alongside over 100 courtiers at a time. Bathing culture didn't collapse until the Renaissance, when syphilis epidemics shuttered public bathhouses across Europe, which means the medieval period was actually cleaner than what followed it. History rarely moves in a straight line upward. The beauty standards you'd face are worth pausing on, in a way that makes you want to lie down. A high forehead ranked as the #1 beauty ideal, so women plucked or shaved their hairlines back and sometimes burned the follicles with hot pins to prevent regrowth. Eyebrows got plucked thin or removed entirely, and even eyelashes came out. Overplucking led to false eyebrows crafted from mouse fur, and I want that to land properly, so I'll say it once more. Mouse fur, glued to your face. Pale skin served as the ultimate status marker, achieved through ceruse, a mixture of white lead powder and vinegar applied directly to the face, which over time caused skin eruptions, tooth loss, paralysis, and death. That was the trade-off, and people accepted it. Small breasts and a slight belly were desirable as signs of fertility, so women bound their chests with bandeaus to flatten them, while belladonna eye drops dilated the pupils for an alluring look, and also caused headaches, blurred vision, and sometimes permanent blindness. The towering hennin headdress from Burgundy, introduced in the late 14th century, could reach 1 meter tall, and castle doorways sometimes had to be physically modified to accommodate them. Looking good and slowly dying were, in medieval Europe, apparently the same pursuit. Noble diets turned out to be surprisingly unhealthy compared to what peasants ate, which is counterintuitive until you learn the details. Nobles considered vegetables and dairy to be inferior foods fit only for peasants. And so their meals ran heavy on meat, sugar, and fat, while lacking vitamin C and fiber. The result was gout, obesity, scurvy, and rotting teeth. A 2022 Cambridge study analyzing over 2,000 Anglo-Saxon skeletons found no meaningful isotopic difference between elite and common diets, which means the grand feasts you see in films were occasional spectacles, not daily reality. The people eating bread, cabbage, and legumes were actually healthier than the people eating roast swan. Spices consumed aristocratic budgets on an enormous scale. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and saffron functioned as the ultimate status symbols, and the annual cost of spices imported to late medieval Europe equaled the cost of grain to feed 1.5 million people. You could nourish a small country or season your dinner, and the aristocracy chose dinner. But roughly a third of the calendar year required religious fasting, with no meat, dairy, or eggs, which drove creative substitutions like almond milk, faux eggs poured into blown-out eggshells, and fish courses featuring whale, seal, and porpoise, all technically marine creatures, and therefore not meat by the Church's generous reading of biology. Medieval theology bent easily when dinner was at stake. As bad as all of that sounds, from the forced marriages to the rat-infested castles to the lead face paint, we haven't reached the part that actually killed you. And this is where the fairy tale doesn't just fall apart, it catches fire. One common misconception needs clearing up first. The claim that everyone in the Middle Ages died at 35 isn't accurate, because that number gets dragged down by horrific infant mortality, where roughly 30% of babies died before their first birthday, and around 50% of children never reached adulthood. A 2017 study in the Journal of Economic History, covering over 115,000 European nobles, found that those born between 800 and 1400 averaged approximately 48 years at adult age of death, rising to 54 for those born between 1400 and 1650. Plenty of time remained to suffer. The danger wasn't that life ran short, it was surviving everything that stood between you and old age. Childbirth sat at the top of that list. The maternal mortality rate in medieval Europe ran approximately 1 to 1.2% per birth, and that number only looks survivable until you consider how many births a noblewoman faced. Wet nurses enabled conception within months of delivery, meaning a fertile noblewoman might produce a child every 1 to 2 years, potentially 8 to 15 children across her reproductive life. The lifetime risk across all those pregnancies worked out to approximately 1 in 18, which means if you gathered 18 of your friends together, one of you would die doing this. That rate ran 50 to 100 times higher than today's figures. Eleanor of Castile bore 16 children over 25 years of marriage to Edward I, including during travels to the Holy Land on crusade, and 10 of those 16 children died before reaching adulthood. A 63% mortality rate inside the royal family itself. And here's a finding that unsettled me when I came across it. Before 1750, aristocratic infant mortality actually exceeded that of commoners. The reason appears to be wet nursing. Noble women didn't breastfeed, which meant they could conceive again almost immediately, and those rapid repeat pregnancies proved dangerous for both mother and child. The privilege itself became the killer. Royal births unfolded inside specially prepared rooms, where the mother entered confinement approximately 6 weeks before the expected delivery. The birthing chamber was sealed with tapestries over the windows and herbs burning for purification, kept dark, warm, and quiet as a kind of external recreation of the womb. Men were strictly forbidden from entering. In 15th century Belgium, a man named Henner Vandendam received a fine of 15 livres for hiding behind a staircase to listen to his wife give birth, just for listening. Pain relief during labor was largely forbidden, based on biblical teaching that women should bring forth children in suffering, so spiritual aids took the place of medicine. Prayers to Saint Margaret, birthing girdles wrapped around the belly, and sympathetic magic like opening cupboard doors and untying knots. Protein analysis of a 15th century birthing girdle detected cervicovaginal fluid on the fabric, confirming these objects saw actual use during labor, not just ceremonial display. The leading killer after delivery was puerperal fever, a bacterial infection with no understanding of germ theory behind it. Midwives moved from patient to patient without washing their hands. Sir Jane Seymour died approximately 12 days after delivering the future Edward VI. Mary de Bohun, who gave birth to the future Henry V, died the same way, as did Marjorie Bruce, daughter of Robert the Bruce. Maria Leopoldine of Austria died at 17 after her very first delivery. Plague didn't spare the highborn either. Joan of England, daughter of Edward III, died of plague on July 1st, 1348, in Bordeaux while traveling to her own wedding. Edward III's surviving letter expresses intense bitterness of heart at the death of his dearest daughter. The planned Anglo-Castilian alliance collapsed with her, and in the calculus of medieval monarchy, both losses counted. Bonne of Bohemia, Queen Joan of France, who had been called the brains behind the throne, and Joan II of Navarre all died of plague in 1349 alone. But royalty tried to outrun the disease by fleeing to country estates, sealing their courts and isolating themselves. But a 2017 study found evidence that noble women may have faced higher plague mortality than noble men. Wealth could buy you a nicer room to die in, but it couldn't buy immunity. Given all of this, the forced marriages, the dangerous pregnancies, the plague, the lead cosmetics, the mouse fur eyebrows, you might assume medieval princesses were simply victims, trapped inside a system designed to use them up and discard them. The historian Alison Weir described the ideological framework they operated within. Princesses grew up understanding they'd been born of an inferior sex. Women were instruments of the devil, authors of original sin, the only imperfection in God's creation. Every husband held the right to enforce obedience however he saw fit, and wife-beating was common, with the Church's great contribution being to limit the length of the rod a husband could use, not to ban it, just to limit it. Calling these women victims, though, gets the story completely wrong. What stands out most about medieval princesses isn't how much they suffered, it's what they accomplished inside that suffering. Eleanor of Aquitaine served as Queen of France and then Queen of England, travelled on the Second Crusade, and bore 10 children. When her sons revolted against Henry II, she backed the rebellion and tried to flee disguised in men's clothing, only to be captured and imprisoned for 16 years in various castles by her own husband. After Henry died, she stepped into the role of regent for Richard the Lionheart at nearly 70. And when Richard was captured on his way home from the Crusades, Eleanor wrote to Pope Celestine III in language that still scorches the page. "My guts are torn from me. My family is carried off and removed from me." 150,000 marks. That's what she raised for his ransom. She thwarted her other son John's attempts to seize the throne, and at nearly 80 years old, she crossed the Pyrenees in winter to fetch a bride for her grandson. 82 years she lived, in the 12th century, when most people didn't see 50. Isabella of France, married to Edward II at 12, endured years of neglect as her husband lavished attention on male favorites before he confiscated her lands, arrested her household staff, and took her children. What she did next was travel to France, raise a mercenary army, invade England, and have her husband's favorite publicly hanged, drawn, and quartered, with the chronicler Froissart claiming she ate an apple while watching the execution. Edward abdicated, and Isabella ruled as regent until her teenage son staged his own coup. Her burial arrangements tell you everything about her. She was laid to rest in her wedding dress, with Edward's heart placed on her chest. The Empress Matilda we met at the beginning of this story didn't stop at one escape. After crossing that frozen river in December of 1142, she kept fighting for another decade. The crown never landed on her head, but her son became Henry II, and the Plantagenet dynasty she secured lasted over 300 years. The epitaph on her tomb reads, "Great by birth, greater by marriage, or greatest in her offspring." Even in death, she was defined entirely by the men around her. Not every story ended that way. Joanna of Castile became queen in 1504, and then her father and husband held a secret meeting, declared her insane, and split her kingdom between them. After her husband died, her son, Emperor Charles V, kept her imprisoned at the royal palace at Tordesillas, ordering that no person speak with her, for no good could come from it. During a 1520 rebellion, her jailers admitted she'd been detained by force and imprisoned for 14 years as though she had not been sane, and that when people did speak with her, she responded freely, with prudence and judgment. 49 years she held the title of Queen of Castile, and she governed none of them, dying alone at 75 after roughly 46 years of confinement. Modern historians increasingly believe her so-called madness was entirely political. Ingeborg of Denmark married Philip II of France on August 14, 1193, and the very next morning, one day after the wedding, Philip declared he couldn't stand her and demanded an annulment. When she received the news, Ingeborg screamed in Latin, "Mala Francia, Roma, Roma," meaning bad France, to Rome, to Rome. 20 years she fought that annulment, refusing to accept it while Philip imprisoned her in increasingly horrible conditions. By 1203, she'd managed to smuggle a letter to the Pope, writing that she had no relief in her prison, that visitors were forbidden, and that she could not even hear the word of God. Philip reconciled with her in 1213, purely for political advantage, and they never shared a bed again. She outlived him. Anna Komnene, a Byzantine princess born in 1083, turned her confinement into something else entirely. After a failed coup attempt confined her to a monastery for roughly 35 years, she wrote the Alexiad, a 15-book epic history of her father's reign, and the First Crusade that remains the only account of the Crusades from the Byzantine perspective, and the first complete history written by a woman. She didn't escape her tower. She built something permanent inside it. Where you were born shaped every part of this experience. Byzantine princesses retained Roman legal rights to inherit, own, and manage property. Rights that dwarfed anything available to married women in Western Europe. Byzantine women could practice medicine, and literacy spread more widely among them. A Castilian law allowed princesses to inherit the throne when no sons existed, making it the most progressive succession system in Western Europe, while France, under Salic law from 1316, barred women from the throne entirely. England lacked a formal prohibition, which technically permitted female succession when Matilda claimed the crown in 1141. But cultural resistance hit brutally. The chronicler of the Gesta Stephani attacked Matilda not for incompetence, but for behaving in ways not proper to the gentle sex. And as historian Marjorie Chibnall observed, what might in a man have passed for dignity and firm control was condemned in her as arrogance. The rules applied differently to women, and they always had. These women were imprisoned by their own families, declared insane for political convenience, and denied the thrones they legally held. They still managed to found dynasties, command armies, write histories, and redraw the map of Europe. The fairy tale version of a medieval princess waits in a tower for rescue. The real version breaks out of the tower dressed as a corpse, crosses a frozen river in a white cloak, or spends 20 years writing furious letters to the Pope. Christine de Pizan captured it best in 1405. She was the first professional female author in European history, and she was exhausted from hearing that women were weak, fickle, and easily deceived. Her response went like this: "If women are so flighty, fickle, changeable, susceptible centaur, and inconstant, as some clerks would have us believe, why is it that their suitors have to resort to such trickery to have their way with them? For there is no need to go to war for a castle that is already captured." 600 years later, the defiance in that sentence still lands. If you had been born a medieval princess, here is what your life would have actually contained. You'd have been betrothed before you could read and married before you finished growing, then shipped to a foreign country whose language you might not speak. Heirs would be expected of you in a dark room where no man could enter, with no pain relief, while someone tied a prayer girdle around your belly and opened all the cupboard doors. 1 in 18, those were your odds of dying in the process, and your surviving children faced a 50% chance of never reaching adulthood, or with aristocratic babies actually faring worse than peasant babies, because wet nursing enabled dangerously rapid pregnancies. Lead would coat your face and mouse fur would line your eyebrows. Your best dress would hang in a toilet shaft. Your days would revolve around managing a 100-person household in a smoke-filled stone fortress while your husband fought somewhere far away. The church would limit the size of the rod he could beat you with and call that mercy, while an education equal to any man's would still lock you out of every university on the continent. Luck might bring you real power, as a regent or diplomat or military strategist, hiding behind the fiction that you were merely keeping the seat warm. Bad luck meant your own family sealing you in a room for 46 years and telling the world you'd lost your mind. What the fairy tale gets most wrong isn't the suffering, it's the strength. These women didn't wait to be rescued. They wrote letters to popes, raised armies, escaped over frozen rivers in white cloaks, authored histories, and built dynasties, all of it inside a world that told them every single day that they were the only imperfection in God's creation. And through all of it, every last grinding, brutal, absurd century of it, not a single glass slipper ever appeared.